Hi, in today's video I'm going to cover the TAKT rhythm sequencer from Flame Instruments. Now you might remember I used it in my previous video on the FIRE drum module, and the link is just up there, to sequence the drums over MIDI. But in today's video we're going to dive deep into how TAKT works, explore all its many unique features, and hopefully make a little bit of music along the way. So first, let's take a listen to what it can do. Well, that was a lot of fun, and you saw how easy I could generate grooves and rhythms and how playable and hands-on it was. So let's get started diving in with an overview of the module. We'll take it from the top down. You have 8 gate outputs here for triggering drums or anything in your rack for that matter, and you have CV output which can be used to send velocity or modulation information. And the nice thing is you can record velocity and modulation independently, so if you are controlling something over MIDI, you can send the velocity over the MIDI and modulation independently over these CV outputs. Great for modulating filters or sidechaining, as we'll see later. You get 4 LFO outputs. Now these LFOs are actually really well done, and I'll show you how to configure them using these settings here. The LFOs also have built-in VCAs, believe it or not, so they can modulate each other. You can have one LFO modulate another LFO to create decaying or changing sounds over time. Then we have the MIDI output. So TAKT can sequence over both MIDI and CV or gate using just one simple TRS cable here, and it is TRS MIDI B. We go MIDI out to MIDI in, and straight away we're playing sounds. You could, of course, patch this using CV and gate if you so wished. We get a clock output here, which I tend to use as my clock divider, and I just patch this here because I'm going to use this to clock my delays over here, for example. In terms of input, we have a MIDI input here, we have a clock input and a reset input, so if you wanted to clock it externally using an external clock, you could, and from MIDI input it's again TRS-B. And if you want to clock it externally using MIDI, for example, I like to clock it sometimes using my Oxy1, and I would take the MIDI output from here, and then I would patch that into the MIDI input here. Actually, I would patch it into this MIDI mult here. You can't use a standard mult for MIDI because it has to be buffered, and also the way it's a stereo, basically it's a stereo TRS cable you're using. Just one word. Oxy1, for example, is TRS-A output. This expects TRS-B output, so make sure you have some sort of converter cable. Now let's talk about how content or notes are structured in the device. You have scenes, and a scene can be loaded or saved, so I can click load and jump to one of 50 scenes. So if I load it up there, that's scene number 1 loaded. Scenes are comprised of 4 main patterns, A, B, C, and D, and a fill pattern. The way these patterns work is these are the rhythmic patterns that you might jump between. So you might have like intro, breakdown, chorus, and fills are just that. They're fills which will just jump in whenever you actually want to fill in between movements. Fill, as soon as you press fill, it'll start playing. So let's take a listen. Now if I switch to pattern B, different rhythm. Pattern D, and I could do a fill. If you want to clear a pattern, press and hold clear. You'll see the screen says CLR for clear. Press A, and that clears out pattern A, and now it's blank. If you want to copy patterns on top of each other, you can't swap them, but you can copy one pattern on top of another one. So you can make a bass pattern, say an A, and then copy it into B, C, and D, and then create variations. The way to do it is you hold down this button, which says copy, and you see the screen says COP for copy. You hold down the source, which is B, and you hold down the destination, which is A, then you release them. Now if I go to A, you'll see that I have a pattern, and it's the same here as B, because they were copied on top of each other. You notice I'm hitting the play, start, stop button here. This is your play control, so you can set the tempo there, and the start, stop button. Okay, so we have 4 patterns, and in each pattern we have 8 tracks. But how am I recording all of this stuff into these patterns? Where's the step sequencer, you might ask yourself? Well, here's the first thing that it took me a while to get my head around. There's no step sequencer so much in this. Obviously there is, because it's playing the rhythmic patterns, but you don't program in triggers like you would say on a TAKT or a deluge or any step sequencer like where you're punching in XOX style triggers on a grid. Instead, you're using these knobs to tell the looper what type of rhythmic patterns to record. And this is where you have to kind of get your head around a different way of working with the device. Takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you get it, it really, really becomes a powerful way of jamming on the fly. Let's go ahead and clear out pattern A, so it's empty. And now we want to record. So let's look at how we actually go about recording. The first thing we need to know is quantization. So like most sequencers, you've got a concept of quantizing. So if I press the top row here, these are the menu controls. So first I want to check what's my quantization for track 1 going to be set to. We're going to record a 4 on the floor kick onto track 1. Now, if it's set here to 16, that means I'm going to record 16th notes. You're telling the looper, throw in a load of 16th kicks. Let's take a listen. What happens if we try and record? So I'm just going to mute everything. I press the mute button here, and this is just going to let me mute all the other tracks. Okay? Not that there's anything in them, but they're going to be muted. So to record, you press and hold the track key you want to use. So we'll hit play. Now nothing happens. I just got one kick. And why is that? And here you hear the kick again. Well, here we get into the difference between one-shot recording and sort of what we'll call shots or like looped phrases recording. If you want a finger drum, you want to make sure this shots button here is off, right? If it's off, you can punch in manually. So let me try and punch in manually the kicks. So there I punched in my kicks and they're quantized to 16ths. So this would be great, for example, for hi-hats. Let's go in and punch in some hi-hats on track 2. I'm going to unmute track 2. I'm going to check my quantization for track 2 and I'm going to see it's off. So let's set that to 16. You see there's an awful lot. You know, you can have triplets, you can have doublets, many, many different ways of trying to record. But let's try and record some hi-hats here now. So now we've recorded in a manual pattern and they're quantized to 16ths. So that's a fairly basic way of recording, but there's actually a more fun way and a much more immediate way to record things. So let's just clear out the pattern again. We'll press clear, press A, and the pattern is cleared, and we'll check mute. There, everything. We're just going to go in and mute everything again. I'm going to go in to track 1. I'm going to turn off quantization. And for track 2, I'm going to turn off quantization. Now you're going to see what this does. When you turn off quantization, this beat knob now controls what gets recorded on the track. So if I have 4, the beat knob on 4, it's going to play 4 beats per bar, 4 on the floor standard kick. This would be 8, this would be 16ths, 30 seconds. Tick plays it at the MIDI clock tick rate, which is 96ths, so it's be fairly fast. Let's just record a 4 on the floor. I want to turn on shots recording. This basically records in synchronization with the clock looped phrases of rhythms that you can play live using these knobs. So instead of finger drumming, like I was previously with shots was turned off, I turn on shots and now I can record looped phrases which are constantly evolving and changing. So looped phrases is on, quantization is off, 4 on the floor, beat programmed in, let's go. Okay, very straightforward. Now, let's go over here and we want to record in, say, hi-hats on the 8ths. Nothing too exciting going on here. I'm just showing you the basics. We'll get to the more advanced stuff in a second. Okay, now we're recording that in. That's great. Now I want to introduce the concept of hold for you, and this is this hold control. What hold does is it basically freezes what's recorded on the track and then allows you to jam live over it. Now, I love this. Once I figured this out, this really opened up the module for me. So I'm going to put hold in place on tracks 1 and 2 because they have the kick and the hat on them. And that means whatever I do now on the controls will play live while I'm holding it, but as soon as I let go, it'll go back to what was recorded there. So you can straight away see this is great for improvising fills or transitions or builds or drops. So again, as a reminder, there's our 4 on the floor of the hat. Now let's go in. We still have shots mode turned on, remember, and improvise over that. I'm going to press and hold track 2 for the hi-hat. You see how I was able to turn the beat knob? I can do it the same with the kick. And it's playing it while I have the button held. As soon as I let go of the button, it goes back to what's recorded. Great for recording improvisation. Let's look at some other improvisations we can record on top of that. One of the things you'll notice here is the velocity knob. The velocity knob obviously sets the MIDI note velocity of the notes being generated. So let's go over to our hi-hat track here, and we'll turn off hold on track 2, because what I want to do is maybe record, and I'm going to clear track 2. I want to record in much more hi-hats because we're going to play around with velocity modulation. Now I want to clear track 2 because I want to record in, say, more hi-hats, and I'm going to play around with the velocity so you can hear the effect that this has. So I'm going to press clear. Now to clear track 2, you don't press clear on the track number, believe it or not. You press clear on the button directly above it. Confused me at first. It took a little bit of getting used to. So clear on the pattern will clear the pattern when the sequencer stops. Clear on the track will clear the track. Okay, now we just have a kick. Let's hold down track 2. Now you hear there, we've got a nice 16 pattern laid in. I'll turn off all variation. Now, look what I've just done here. I've adjusted the velocity by turning this knob. As I turn it down, the velocity goes to nothing, so they're barely audible. Turn it up to max. Now we get max velocity. If I turn it to just past 12 o'clock, press and hold, turn, you see it's a ramp down in velocity. Do you hear that effect? Let's do a ramp up. So here you hear it getting louder as they progress through the bar. And now we can do random. The idea here is that you could program that in and then have that play, and then you could set hold on it, for example. So it's playing random, and now I could change it to a ramp down, or I could just have it fixed. And then it goes back to random. So whatever you've recorded into the looper gets played, and you can improvise and add over it, and add over it, and add over it, unless hold is turned on, in which case nothing gets added. Okay, what about variation and gate time? What do they do? Okay, let's go back to our hi-hats again, and I'll just turn off, there's our track. I'm just going to mute the kick, and so just track 2 is our hi-hats, okay? And we'll turn off hold here on the hi-hat. So we just have a nice, simple, straightforward 16th note phrase there for the hi-hats. I can even change the hi-hat sound. Sounds pretty good coming out of FIRE. We'll leave it at that. Now, variation allows me to thin out or change the rhythmic structure of what's playing. And to do that, I have to go to the variation menu here. And these buttons select which tracks are changed by this variation knob. Okay, so I'm going to do track 2 because that's where our hi-hat is. We're keeping it real simple right now. Nothing fancy, just kicking a hat so we can see what's going on. Track 2. Okay, now track 2 is now subject to variation. So let's take a listen. As I turn the variation knob to the right, past the midday position, the track slowly thins out. The hat triggers thin out till they almost become sparse and invisible. So to the right of the 12 o'clock position thins out the triggers on the track. And to the left adjusts velocity so that the lower notes become quieter, but the higher velocity notes stay played. So you can thin it out in a different direction here. The general idea is then you're building, looping, recording. There I recorded another hi-hat. We might put a clap on the 4s. Now, say I want to create a little bit something interesting, like a polyrhythm or something a little bit more polyrhythmic on those claps. Let's look at Trackshift and LastStep, these two menu controls over here. Don't worry, we're going to get to quantizing these ones in here. We'll get to them in a moment. They're a little bit more tricky. So first of all, we'll look at Trackshift, okay? Trackshift allows you to select a track and shift it forwards or backwards a certain number of 16 steps or whatever the quantize, or 16 steps. So let's say we want to shift the clap forward a step. So we select track 4 because the clap is on track 4. Now let's listen. There you hear it got shifted. And I'll play the kick again so we can kind of get where we are. Let's go back to where we were. Now you hear the clap and the kick are on the same beat. Clap is right after the kick. That's what we were looking for. Classic 4 on the floor. But that can get a bit boring after a while. You know, you're just listening to the same thing over and over again. Let's use LastStep to adjust the length of the sequence for the clap. LastStep lets you specify how long in 16ths the bar is, whether it's 16 steps or 15 steps. You might be saying, hang on, we only have 1 bar. And I'm going to show you. You actually have 4 bars, and I'll show you how that works in a second. So again, we select track 4 for the clap. And we're going to set it to 15 steps. So the clap is going to loop around at a faster rate than all of the rest of the track. And it'll come in and out of sync and we can get some variation there. This also works very nicely with hi-hats. We might set that back to 16ths. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you in this section on recording is user phrases and Euclidean phrases. And then we'll go on to look at some of the more input and output related stuff. And we'll go back to this as our sequence again. The user phrase allows you to punch in using the classic 16-step trigger XOXO style sequencer input, a phrase which can then be looped on top of whatever you had on the track underneath. So now let me show you how to do the user phrase setup. First of all, we press and hold user edit, this button here, until the light flashes and the display will show the track selector. So I'm going to select track 1, which is our kick. Now remember, that has to be flashing for you to edit the user phrase. Now then, you know our underlying kick is 4 on the floor, but now we could program something like this in, and the user phrase obeys all of these settings over here. So I'm going to set these to 16ths, which means each of these buttons corresponds to 1/16th of a step. And now if we listen, now I've programmed in this kick phrase that's playing on top of the 4 on the floor. That one's muted, and this is playing. I could take those out, put that in. If I change this, the user phrase will play slower because I'm now playing them on 8ths or 30 seconds. So you see, you can build little improvised phrases here. And again, we could play around with the velocity. The kicks get quieter, or they could get random. Euclidean phrases are pretty much the same. We press and hold Edit Euclid until we see the track light illuminate. And we can do this, say, for the clap over here on track 4. This shows the first one is steps, offset, and length. These are the 3 controls we want to say. Control. So this is going to say set 10 steps. How much you want to shift the track in 16ths. And what the last step of your Euclidean sequence is. So you could go now and more steps. There's 16 out of 16. We could make it a 15-step sequence with 12 triggers on it in Euclidean sequence mode. And then we can record that by pressing and holding the track we want to record it onto. And that shows you how you can create Euclidean sequences as well. You can do more than just sequencing MIDI with this, and you can do more than just sequencing drums. And now I'm going to show you how I've used it for sequencing an external, say, voice source like Twin Waves here. And for that, we're going to use track 8. So we'll just go in and we'll mute everything here, and we'll look at track 8. Now, track 8 could play a hi-hat sound over here on my FIRE drum module. I'll just turn down the volume so it doesn't. And right now there's nothing recorded on track 8. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the gate output of track 8 as a trigger into my step 8 sequencer to generate a sequence, and I'm going to patch it up now. So we're also going to generate an envelope to open up the VCA for Twin Waves. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to patch in a multed copy, one into the step input to advance the sequencer, and one into the trigger input here on ZR to generate the envelope. We'll take the standard voice output, and this is just a super square wave here, to the input on veils. And we will take the envelope, and I'll use yellow for the envelope and the modulation, why not? And we'll pop that into the CV input there. We can take the audio from veils, and that's the audio from Twin Waves. We'll pop it into the Akari filter here, and then that'll give us a nice stereo spread of the peaks, and we'll pop that here into this channel on the mixer. Now, let's unmute the channel. Now let's look at recording in some triggers on track 8 here so we can play this monophonic voice. So we'll just start a straight up simple kick here. We can start just very simple 16th notes. I can then adjust variation for that track by turning variation on for track 8. And I can also patch in Stonk over here, which is this great new module from Tesseract, which will allow me to modulate the wave shapes. Now you might have noticed you heard a few drums hits playing when I was moving my hand around. And you may be wondering, what are these things over here? Well, it turns out TAKT actually can be hooked up to proximity sensors. And I got 4 of them when I got TAKT from Flame. And the idea here is that these allow you to trigger individual tracks, look at that, by just waving my finger over it. Now, normally you'd line them all up, but I found if you alternate them, you can actually get better control. You have a bit more. So here, it's as if I'm pressing the button. And say I want to trigger tracks 5 through 8, I would just press the send set button over here. And now that track 5. I'm playing the rim shot over there. So we'll go back to track 1 again. So for example, we could actually use this to, say I press hold on the kick here, we could live jam over the kick. By just like that. So these are great fun to actually put around your case. You probably would want to spread them out maybe on either side of your case, so you can use your left and right hand to jam in. And 4 is actually quite enough, because you're probably not going to live play more than 4 at a time, to be honest. You can turn these off in the menu. We'll look at the setup menu in a second. And if you find that they're getting triggered, like I do find that if I wave, as you see here, my hand, if I was doing something over here, I sometimes find them a little bit too sensitive. You can turn on sunlight mode, which reduces the sensitivity of them. Now, I've just trimmed everything back, so we're just going to take a look at how we set LFOs. The LFOs are controlled using this set of controls here. And you use this button to select between one of each of the 4 LFOs. 1, 2, 3, and 4. These buttons here control the wave shape, the phasing of the LFO, the rate of the LFO, whether it's clock synced or not, and the amplitude of the LFO, and also the range, whether it's unipolar, bipolar, or in inverted unipolar shape. Now, a little counterintuitively, if you press the button, you're describing the parameter on the bottom of the button. I would have thought it was the top of the button. But basically, if you press it now, we're looking at the wave shape here, a sine. A long press allows you to shift the LFO plus or minus 180 degrees, so you can get quadrature LFO shapes. This button here allows you to set the rate. Now, if you're synced, you have many different ways of syncing your LFO to the clock, from 30 seconds all the way over to really slow 4-bar movements with dotted and triplets along the way. So you've got a lot of different LFO shapes. If I turn off the clock sync by just turning the sync mode to off, now when I go to rate, we get a free running LFO that can go from 0 to 140. So you're able to have free running unsynced LFOs. One of the lovely things is if we set the sync mode here, if I go back over to sync mode, we have an option to trigger it by triggers on individual tracks. And that allows you to trigger one-shots of the LFO using triggers that you program in here. Great, for example, generating filter modulations, which you'll see later, or potentially inverted envelopes for sidechaining a kick. I'm just going to set LFO number 1 here to be clock synced, and we'll take a look at what this does on the Mordex data. I'll just patch in LFO 1 here onto the top green trace on data. Now if we just take a look, we can see we've got a very straightforward unipolar sine wave there. If I go over here into range, I can reduce the range down so we get a much smaller amplitude of the LFO, and I can increase it up to 59, which is the maximum. 0 to 59 is the range of the LFO output. If I just long press this, then I can choose between a bipolar LFO, so here we see it going from -5 to +5 volts, unipolar from 0 to 5 volts, or inverted, which is best if you have decay-shaped LFOs. So let's go back over here and set this to unipolar mode. Go back over to the waveform and we'll set it to pulse 1, pulse 2, pulse 3. Down 1 is a ramp down. Down 2 is more of a exponential decay down. So that's more like your classic envelope shape. So if you wanted an envelope out of this, that'd be one way to generate it. Looking at range, if we go past 59, we get into some very strange looking values. If I'm on LFO 1, it says LF2, 3, and 4. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that the value of LFO 1 is being modulated by a VCA that is being controlled by LFO 2, 3, or 4. So there's actually a VCA built into the module on each of the LFOs that can be modulated by the other LFOs. So for example, you could have the output of LFO 1 being modulated by a sine wave on LFO 2, for example. So let's set LFO 1 to a sine wave, and we're going to patch that into the PWM value here on the twin waves, because that's kind of fun to modulate. So we're going to patch that in there. Now let's look at LFO 2. And what I might have LFO 2 be is a much slower, really slow LFO, which I'm going to patch into. It's still clock synced, but it's going to be a real slow LFO. Let's slow it down way down there. And notice now LFO 2 is being modulated by LFO 1. And if I go back to LFO 1, it's being modulated by LFO 2. So now I've got effectively two somewhat chaotic LFOs going on because I have them each modulating each other. So you actually have some really powerful LFO capabilities here. Let's patch this in turn into the assign input on ZR, and that will modulate the envelope warp parameter. So you see the envelope is going to move around. Now let's take a listen. Open up the filter a little bit. Let's patch in the drums here. I'm just going to mute everything on the drums except the kick, because we're going to use that kick in a second. So now we're modulating the envelope shape. Using one LFO, we're modulating the pulse width of the waveform over here using a different one. Now what I want to do is I actually want to use that kick to trigger a one-shot LFO, and I'm going to use that to modulate the filter. So every time we have a kick, I really want to get some like really crazy filter modulation going on with that real classic acid sound. So let's take LFO 3 and we're going to patch it into the mod input here on Ikari. Now let's take a look at how I have LFO 3 set up. Okay, let's just make sure we can see it. Now let's go over here to LFO 3. I'll get this cable out of the way. 1, 2, 3. Now, LFO3 is shaped DO2, and DO2 is this downward shape here. It's like an exponential logarithmic decay waveform. But I don't want to clock sync that LFO. I want to trigger it every time we have a kick. In other words, every time there's a trigger on track 1. So what I'll do is I go into sync mode, and I set the sync from on, which will be clock synced, over to TR1, which is track 1. So now a trigger will trigger it. What's going to be the length of the decay of the envelope? Well, you can set that using the rate. So if we just hit play here, just mute that guy there. Let's patch LFO3 into our data, and we'll see it here on the red trace. And we'll see that envelope going boink, boink, boink. Now we can change that to be bipolar if we wanted, but I think unipolar is just fine. And we will patch that into this filter over here. Now you hear that bounce every time we hit the kick. We get a nice little bit of filter movement. And go the other way. Oh, that's nice. Yeah. You see what you can do now by having one-shot LFOs? You can route them around your patch for some really interesting rhythmic modulation. I want to show you real quick how to do sidechaining using the LFOs triggered by the kick drum. And I've just stripped away all the patch cables here. So for this, we'll just use 2 voices. We'll just mute everything else here. Now, as you can hear, it's your classic case of the kick and that bass line are competing for space in the frequency spectrum. And normally what you want to do is you want to sidechain that main bass line here, and we want to do that so that you can actually hear the kick. So to do that, we go over now, and we're going to use LFO1 for this. So I'll go to LFO1. I've set it to down 3, which is a fast decay logarithmic curve. But the synchronization, it's not clock synced, it's going to be triggered by triggers on track 1, which is the kick. And I've reduced the range down to about halfway, and I'll show you a second what effect that has. And I have set it to SID, which is the inverted envelope. So basically it's going to be an inverted sidechain envelope. So let's just take a listen now. What happens? You can hear that pumping effect beginning to kick in. Let's just play around with some parameters. If I increase this amplitude of that sidechain envelope, we really start to lose a lot of the bass line. I can shorten the envelope length. So we can just fine tune it. See, I can just shorten that. I could reduce this down. More of the bass line comes through. If I increase it up, might be just too much. So you just play around and fine tune it to get that exact sidechaining amount that you're looking for. And all I'm doing it here is very, very simple. I'm just sending it into the level of the mixer channel. In reality, you probably want to send it into your VCA and do some further processing. And if you had a sidechaining mixer, like say the Bass Liquido or a Cockpit from Endorphins, you would use this to do your sidechaining there more effectively. Now let's look at how we can actually record modulation. I'm just going to mute all of the voices here on the mixer. Now we're able to record modulation and velocity alongside the triggers in the sequencer, much like you do with any regular step sequencer. Typically, if you're recording velocity, like you saw when I turned the velocity knob earlier in the video, you're affecting the level of the drums coming out here. But you're actually able to also record modulation independent from that. Let's go to track 8 again, and this is going to be triggering our step sequencer over here to play our bass line. And what we want to do is we want to record some, say, filter sweeps on this using the modulation. So we're going to patch the CV gate output here into track 1 there on Mordex data, which is the green trace. So to set up a track for modulation recording, first of all, we go into the Velo mod menu, we go to track 8, which is the one we want to record onto, and we set it to mode rec. That's going to record the velocity from the knob here. Then we make sure we're in modulation recording mode, which is this bottom LED illuminated. So the top one here is for recording notes and triggers onto the tracks. The bottom one is for recording modulation. Now let's watch the green trace up here on data. So as I hit play, we can start to see, say for example, if I have it on down ramp, you'll start to see every time there's a trigger there on track 8, we're getting a downward ramp. Likewise, I could change that to an upward ramp, or we could play between them and record on different steps, different ramps. We could set it to random, so now I have random modulation amounts coming out of the CV output, or indeed I could do a sweep, a manual sweep here, like this. And you see now that some of the previous values are still there on trigger notes, so you're recording modulation per trigger. So you could just do a little bit, or you could record over everything. So now we could take something like this and patch it into our filter over here into the mod input. And now if we hit play, you can see the effects the modulation we've recorded has. That's really nice. I like that. So between the LFOs being synced to the clock, LFOs triggered from triggers on tracks, and the modulation recorded per track, you actually have a ton of ability here to send modulation around your patch and influence the sounds that you're generating. Well, that wraps up my review and kind of tutorial for the TAKT looping sequencer. As I said at the start, it's a very different take on what would be a standard drum sequencer. You build loops, you build phrases, and you iterate over them using these controls to build variations, saving them into different patterns and jumping between them. And I've had this module now for a few months since Flame sent it to me, so I've used it quite extensively, including playing live, and it really, really is great for hands-on live play. So that frees me up to use the Oxy one for more melodic sequencing of voices, and this for drum sequencing with Fire. I will also point out that as of the time of recording of this video, the Fire module has had an updated firmware. There are new voices. So if we were to select, say, voice 6, we now have an extended clap voice, which has more power, more different sounds, a cowbell, because you always need more cowbell, and a very interesting, where did it go? It was right here a second ago, wavetable. So there's wavetables that we can iterate and play through. I haven't dug into this too deeply yet, and I might do a quick Instagram story on it. So something new from Flame for the Fire. Very nice to see them continually trying to work to update these and add new features. As always, I love hearing from you, so please leave your questions and comments down below in the comments section. And if there's any ideas you have for future videos, let me know. Stay tuned for more videos from me by subscribing, and thanks for watching.